Link TV, connecting you to the world. Link TV is viewer supported. Watch more at linktv.org.
Today on Earth Focus, Chris Flavin, president of the Worldwatch Institute in Washington, D.C., speaks with Link TV correspondent Miles Benson about climate change and its impact on global energy resources. Coming up on Earth Focus.
Christopher Flavin. We're hearing from the scientists who are updating their predictions and expectations, and it seems to be more dire and darker than they had originally suggested. That the numbers are adding up faster than they expected them to, and we're in more trouble than we thought we'd be in. Doesn't that give you a good sense of anxiety?
It has been clear for some time, certainly over the last few years, that the science is coming in not only clearer, but really more frightening in terms of the kinds of changes that we're likely to see coming at us in the quite near future, particularly the melting of glaciers, the kind of water stresses, the threat to food systems that are beginning to emerge already in many countries. It's really coming earlier and in a more damaging way than had been expected. So the urgency of getting things turned around, that is actually seeing a decline in global emissions of greenhouse gases, is getting stronger all the time. But there seems to be almost a complete disconnect between the politics of this and the science. Politics often being driven by immediate economic issues, unemployment, the concerns of particular industries, and hard to get the kind of level of alarm on a part of policymakers that is really needed.
The scientists are forecasting the kind of climate change that is going to be a matter of life and death to human beings, as well as businesses and profits. And the data say we're going to increase our population worldwide to past 9 billion in this century. And if we don't solve this problem, will this planet be able to support 9 billion people?
There's a huge risk, particularly in terms of food production. The ability to grow food, is basically controlled by the climate. The temperatures and the water availability are the two key variables in terms of the ability to produce food. And so the question we face is, what is going to happen to the ability to grow food as a result of climate change? The diminishing water supplies that are projected for many regions are a huge problem, as are the higher temperatures. Maps have been developed that show winners and losers in terms of food production. And there are certainly some areas, for example, large parts of Siberia and Canada will likely be able to produce more food as a result of climate change 30, 40 years from now compared to what they can produce today, because there are areas where the amount of food production is limited in part by the low temperatures during a large part of the year. Those are obviously going to increase. But then there are large areas of the world where food production is likely to go down. That includes large parts of the southern part of the Midwest, southeastern parts of the U.S., but it also includes large areas of the Indian subcontinent and most of Africa. And interestingly, if you look at those two regions in particular, as well as the Middle East, that is one where most of the world's hungry people are today. Two, that's where population growth is the fastest. And so you've got a huge problem coming. And so while on a net basis you might argue, it's almost within the bands of error how much or to what degree food production worldwide will go up or down, the fact that it will almost certainly go down in the areas where food security is the biggest problem suggests that we're going to have huge social and human problems that almost certainly will translate into global security problems as well.
When you talk about an environmental catastrophe, we're talking about human lives being lost, aren't we?
That is almost certainly the case, that we are going to see large numbers of lives lost. It's not only in terms of potentially catastrophic famines, but just extreme climate events, Hurricane Katrina, writ large on a much more massive scale. But we're also looking at sea level rise, which is going to put literally hundreds of millions of people at risk, not only in rural areas, but in some of the world's largest cities as well.
And there are no large sectors of the population in this country or anywhere else that are going to entirely escape the consequences, are there?
Almost everybody will be affected in some way, and if you're not affected directly, it may be because of global security issues, things like migration and potentially terrorism could be indirectly exacerbated as a result of this problem.
Do you think that's getting through to the people in this country now who have either been deaf to or unable to accept the threat?
I don't think that the threat has fully gotten through. Certainly public awareness and level of concern is higher today than it was 5 years ago. There has been a good bit of public education that's gone on thanks to the media, thanks to Al Gore and others. But I think it is still seen as a very sort of distant threat, and the perception is that it's going to come on us very gradually. There's always another problem that's more urgent. Right now it's the global recession and shortages of jobs, and it's very hard to make a problem like this, rise up into the top tier level of issues politically. And you almost get to a question of, are we really wired as a species to deal with long-term problems? I mean, we're clearly able to deal with short-run threats. We've survived over hundreds of thousands of years and evolved as a species with that in mind. Can we now respond to a long-term threat that may be a bigger challenge for our children and grandchildren than it is for us? I think that's one of the central problems now, or one of the central questions now facing the human species.
Do we have the political mechanisms in place to deal with this, or do we have to create some new ones, institutions on a global basis, or a different way of organizing to deal with this?
We certainly have a lot of institution building to deal with this. Not only at the state, local, national level, but at the international level as well. I mean, a lot of these things have to be implemented locally, and they need local political support as well. But I think that's the challenge, is we need to mobilize at every level of society, but particularly the developing countries are going to need international institutional support and financial help.
It's essentially, though, a government problem to solve, isn't it? You can't expect anyone but governments to be the prime movers in answering this threat.
I actually think that this is a challenge both for government and for the private sector and for individuals. It is really working at this from every angle that we're going to get it solved. For example, government can set the policy, say putting a price on carbon, establishing policies to introduce renewable energy. Ultimately, the private sector is going to have to actually deliver the solutions, whether it be inventing new energy technologies, figuring out new ways to save energy. But government creates the framework in which that private sector innovation occurs.
Could you talk a little bit about your concept of a green economy, what it offers, what it might cost? Is it a net plus or a net minus for the overall world's economy?
The hope on the part of many today is that the effort to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy sources, to improve energy efficiency, to have reuse and recycling on a massive scale, is that by its nature can create billions of dollars of new economic opportunity and then millions and millions of new jobs. That's really what is meant by the green economy. And one of the things that is fortuitous is that most of the things we need to do to deal with the climate problem, such as replacing coal with solar energy, say, turns out to actually be more labor intensive.
So it would be a net job gain, you think?
the economy as a whole is barely going to be affected one way or the other, that it all basically nets out, that there are going to be losses, you know, in the fossil fuel industries, for example, and then gains in, for example, people that weatherize homes. Those businesses and workers are going to benefit. The important point, though, is that there are going to be certainly winners and losers. And I think if you look at the battle over climate legislation in the U.S. as well as other countries, that's largely what's going on now, is basically a battle between the potential winners and the potential losers. And of course, there's always more economic power in the industries of today than the ones that might be created in the future. And I think that's mainly the reason that we've had such difficulty in moving this ball forward. But the good news is that these new green industries are growing stronger all the time, which means not only that they're going to have more jobs and, you know, more profits, et cetera, but they're actually going to have more money to put into lobbying as well. So their size relative to the traditional carbon interests are increasing.
Are there particular aspects of a green economy that are further along and are rolling a little bit more successfully than others, and what might they be?
There are a number of sectors of the green economy that have already emerged on a large scale. The global wind power business is one of the largest parts of the global power industry. In both Europe and the U.S., we're now adding more wind capacity each year than we're adding coal or nuclear. In fact, probably more than coal and nuclear combined. Only natural gas is actually ahead. So the wind business alone is worth tens of billions of dollars and is a very sizable part of the overall power generation business. Interestingly, wind is growing very rapidly even in China. In fact, by the end of this year, China is going to have the largest wind power industry in the world. Recycling has also emerged as a very large sector. I mean, there are literally hundreds of thousands of people around the world that are employed in recycling. You know, everything from just, you know, simple paper recycling to advanced electronics.
What's your sense of our time frame? How fast are we going to have to move before we get to the point where it's too late?
We have to move almost immediately now. We've really run out of time. We've been struggling to deal with this problem now for close to 2 decades, and the next 5 years are critical. We really need to turn things around, not only with policy, but the emissions need to actually be going down. We need to really be transforming the energy system. I see a lot of signs that we're pretty close to making that kind of turnaround. There's a lot of momentum underway in terms of actual industry level, you know, actual government level progress, but we don't yet have the kind of strong signal either from the national government in the U.S. or from the international community through an international convention to make that happen.
You sound optimistic.
I'm tentatively optimistic. I mean, if we can do a few things right in the next couple of years, I think we can really turn the corner on this one.
Christopher Flavin, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs which connect you to the world. To learn more, visit linktv.org.